when you put money in the stock market and Goldman Sachs or BlackRock or whatever earns money, that's money that they're then using to oppress you. The questions that I have for you beyond kind of what's going on with Roger and whatnot is just, I mean, we can talk the LP if you want, because there is all kinds of shenanigans going on, and I don't even know. Like I haven't been involved for over a year. Like I was involved for a short period of time.
I also want to challenge you on agorism sometime.
Oh,
we can either do that here, or maybe we can do that on Anarchist sometime. It's up to you.
That's fine. I actually, I'm an agorist from the standpoint of like 95% of the stuff I'm on board with in terms of like Konkin and, you know, whether it be, you know, Sal or some of the other like more notable like people that would label themselves as agorists that are out there. But like I said before, I think I look at some of the aspects of agorism that are more passive, and I wonder, or not just wonder, but I see in my daily life that it takes a little bit more proactiveness than some of the other kind of like more, I don't want to call them like passive aggressive, but like, you know, the more kind of like under the radar things that are like a typical agorist thinks is going to perpetuate the fall of the system, right? Because they just don't scale, right? Like agorism doesn't scale. And the thought process with agorism has always been, or at least the theory was, that if you get to like 3 or 5% of the population, that could then tip the system because of how imbalanced or weak the system is. I don't know if you ever get there, because I really don't. I've met enough people and I've talked to enough people where they're just not capable of it. Like, you know, they're you probably know from talking philosophy with a lot of people, like a lot of like normies, they have the same, like if you go out to a bar and have a drink and you just talk up the people that are there, most everyone there has the same desires, right? Like it's just, they want safety, security, they want to have a good life, have fun, you know, maybe have a family or relationship or feel loved or whatever, right? We differ in terms of how we get there, and most people default to authority. And it's I think a lot of people want to say like, oh, well, it's not always been that way. No, it's always been that way. Like for the entirety of human history, like 95% of the population at least will look to an authority figure, even if they know that the authority figure is bullshit. Right?
Iron law of oligarchy.
Yeah.
There will always be leaders. How they're chosen is what changes.
Oh, yeah. And not to mention the fact that even the mechanics of how they're changed is also, I would argue, isn't necessarily that much different now than it was then, because we're still dealing with the divine right of kings, right? Like we were talking back about how politicians essentially think they're all right and good and everyone else is stupid, right? It's because they think they're God kings, right? Like they think they are touched by some kind of divine power that has made them be able to see the path forward, and everyone else just can't see it. So, you know, they're just going to lead all the lemmings off the cliff. But when we get to the cliff, we'll be able to fly. Don't worry, right? Like, I mean, like that's the thinking, right?
I mean, there was a lot in what you said. So briefly, I'll just touch on parenting as the root cause. So we're all programmed from birth because it's part of the human species. We accept the reality with which we're presented when we enter this existence. And if the reality that we're presented with for the first 10 years of our life is authoritarian, obey because I told you to, obey because I have the authority to make you behave, I will punish you if you don't, I will beat you, I will cage you, I will take your stuff, you know, I will rule you. Then when you become an adult, you expect the world to continue being that way, and you continue looking for those authorities to exist over you and over other people. And the government jacks into that with the plug, the matrix back of the brain stem plug, by saying, yeah, we're that authority, and now that you're an adult, you actually get to be part of the authority by voting, and now you have a say in how you're controlled. So it's kind of like a promotion from you as a child, you know.
Yeah.
and and so that's the state of the world. It's because people have been parented coercively for all throughout history, and so when they reach adulthood, they not only do they expect the world to mirror that, but they demand it because they feel uncomfortable if such an authority doesn't exist. It's like they become an adult, and if we were in a free society, a coercively parented kid would become an adult, and suddenly they would no longer have an oppressor. And I mean, what a existentially terrifying state to be in suddenly.
Yeah.
Now what am I supposed to do with all this power over myself? I need somebody to tell me what I need to do. That's so as we parent better, the world will improve. That is the most powerful form of activism there is parenting better. That's why I started the Peaceful Parenting University, where I teach parenting classes to try and give people the toolbox on how to parent their children non-coercively. And
I didn't even know you did that.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I put out one season. I need to kind of redo some of the content. It's a little aged now, but yeah, several years ago I did. And that is the most powerful form of activism. That's why I was so motivated to it. Now to agorism. Let me just make some hot takes and see if we can locate disagreement, because I didn't disagree with anything you just said, because I mean most of the stuff you just said was critical of agorist ideas in general. I would say that agorism does almost absolutely nothing in terms of attacking the state or diminishing the state's power or really doing anything at all. Except the thing it does do is often limits an agorist's ability to be successful in the world, which makes them actually vastly less efficacious as activists affecting change in the world, because you're not successful and you don't have the resources to affect the world around you to the degree that you do, because you've limited yourself to these out of the system, off the books venues that are necessarily less profitable. So that's my initial hot take. How does that sit with you?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, because I mean, the title of this channel is The Anarchist Investor, right? It's I didn't name it The Agorist Investor for obvious reasons. That would be
a real challenge, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, so for instance, I don't advocate people put money into stocks. I think stocks are just as fraudulent, if not more so, than fiat currency. Right now, a lot of people would say, well, how do you make up the stagger in terms of inflation, or, how do you save for a potential retirement or whatever? There is just as many returns that you can make in terms of, say, investing in real estate, investing in your own business, whether it be a side hustle or something like that, that can mirror, if not outpace, the gains that you make in the stock market. And when you put money in the stock market and Goldman Sachs or BlackRock or whatever earns money, that's money that they're then using to oppress you, right? And so from my standpoint, if you can still work within the normie world, right, but send less of that money to get chopped up by, Wall Street, and essentially end up within that kind of DC, corporate cycle, right, where they suck money in and they don't give it back out. Actually, someone made an absolutely fantastic observation the other day, where they were talking about using cash versus using cash in your account on, say, like a debit or a credit card. And they were like, think about it this way. Even though US dollars are pieces of shit, right, there's still a place for them. Okay. You still should have some of them. You can't completely swear them off, because, just for instance, in the event of a catastrophe, we had Superstorm Sandy happen up here, right? If you went to the gas station and all the pumps are down, I still could have bought gas, because the pumps themselves work. It was basically the computer and the cash register that weren't working, right? And so I had fives and singles. Right? I can buy gas. I just give the gas guy the cash and I walk away with it, right? So there's an argument for cash in limited spaces. But so anyway, a lot of people are advocating that you use cash to try and get away from the CBDC hell that we're careening toward, right? And someone was like, well, yeah, but that's just effectively like kind of like swiping your debit card or whatever. And they're like, no, it's not, because say you shop local and go to a person that you like and it's not a big corporation, you give them cash, they get to pocket the full amount of the cash. Granted, if they want to report it, like they have to take a piece off for Uncle Sam, but they get the whole bit of cash. If you swipe your card, now Capital One or some other payment processor that's a Wall Street company gets 3.5 points or whatever their VIG is, right? And that money never makes it back to you, right? Like it goes into an ecosystem that stays within that ecosystem, especially if, and I learned this when, I'm sorry, this is like a really long-winded explanation.
No, I appreciate it.
But I learned this when I first started looking at the spike that was driven between races to create racial tension in the 90s. So like the Rodney King riots and the whole, O.J. Simpson thing and all this other stuff, right? The stuff that happened in L.A. Love me some rooftop Koreans, right? But so someone was talking about the economics of, say, like black culture versus white culture. And they were like, look, I don't want to be racist, but here's a fact. Within the black community, $1 only cycles one time before it leaves, right? And they were talking about inner urban communities, right? Mm-hmm. And they were talking about, all right, now let's look at, this is very difficult to talk about right now. In fact, I'm probably going to get censored by YouTube, but within Jewish communities,
I have some music for that.
Yeah, that same dollar recycles like 5 or 6 times before it ever leaves that community. So it has more time to sit and build up and reinvest within the community in which it's helping before it exits. Well, what we've seen over the last, 100 years since the Federal Reserve started, but more so it's been accelerated since, say, 1980 with low interest rates, you see most dollars getting chopped up, and that sucking sound is Wall Street and corporations pulling all of that money out of Main Street, right? Mm-hmm. And so now, from an agorist standpoint, okay, I can't necessarily tell everyone just to kind of like barter with each other because it's not feasible, right? Like it doesn't work unless you live on a commune, right? Mm-hmm. And then we have all the other issues that we talked about. So you have to live at least part of your life within normie world because you're going to end up cutting off yourself so much. Not to mention the fact that if all you do is live outside of normie world, you're never going to recruit anyone, right? Like you're never going to show anyone the way. Most of the people that kind of like talk on YouTube and whatnot, even Sal and that kind of thing, like he's brought a lot of people to kind of at least think about like anarchy and that kind of thing. But it's because he hasn't completely walled himself off, right? But traditional agorism, that's essentially what you're doing. You're kind of creating like a smaller community, and you might be actually doing business with the people that are incarcerating you, right? Because they're the ones that have all of the money. And so to make yourself at least able to live, you have to operate in a black or a gray market and do, backroom deals with the evilest of people for that agorist mechanism to work. Whereas if you live with one foot in either side and you do it with intention, this is the thing though. This is why most people can't do this, is because you have to be analytical about it. You just can't be like, Bitcoin number go up, and so I'm going to put my money into it, right? Nvidia go up, I'm going to put my money into it. You can't do that. You have to analyze it. You have to understand what you're buying or selling and what the end effect is that you're having in it, right? If I buy a piece of property and rent it, I'm actually doing more to destroy the government because there's more preferential tax treatment if I'm a real estate owner and I rent or I invest or I develop, right? So I'm actually able to, it's not like, net on net. If I made $100,000 in real estate, I pay less tax than if I made 100,000 building widgets in my garage, right? And that's assuming I report everything. But so like from that standpoint, I know that's a really long-winded example, but a lot of agorists, they end up painting themselves into a corner and they become much less effective at doing whatever it is that they want to achieve because of it.
What is the telos of agorism for you? Because I think we might have been talking past each other just then.
No, no, the idea, as I understand it, and again, I'm not like a disciple of Konkin, okay?
Yeah.
But so as I understand it, and if I understand the question you're asking me, is that kind of like the mechanism, or are you talking about the end goal?
Purpose. What's the
Okay.
purpose of agorism?
So the purpose of agorism is essentially to undermine the state so that it collapses under its own weight.
Okay.
Okay.
And do you think it's effective at doing that?
I think the idealism, like the ideal scenario that wouldn't come about, could do it. But right, it's that ideal scenario that can't be achieved because not enough people would ever buy in.
I agree. So then do we also agree that agorism is not effective at its purpose?
I think it is effective at its purpose, not on a grand scale. So, for instance, there are cases where, say, in some of the most extreme tyrannical regimes, such as communist Russia, even during World War II with the Nazis in Germany, the entire system didn't fall, but there were internal agorist activities, I'll call it, that contributed to the economic undermining. But ultimately, it wasn't just agorism, right?
I would actually argue that the agorist activity in those locations at those times prolonged the existence of that system.
That's interesting.
By providing people a black market route to get the goods and services that they needed to survive under it, and it might have collapsed faster had they not had those networks to survive through. So let's just say that you have a point and I have a point, and
yep.
if we average them out, we can probably agree that, well, maybe it was a neutral effect then. Because maybe it did help. Maybe it did help accelerate the collapse in some ways, but maybe it did retard the collapse in some ways. So probably at best it was ineffectual.
I would say that on a global, this is where a lot of people get stuck, like we were talking about, in terms of like really kind of getting painted into a corner, or like you said, getting a boner for a particular concept, right? They think.
Did I say that? Man,
you
I gotta work on my. Yeah, I gotta work on how I describe things.
And it's entirely accurate too. There's certain idealistic philosophies or practices, right, that work within certain context, but then get extrapolated to be this global kind of concept, and it doesn't work globally, right? So, for instance, I have absolutely no doubt that over a period of time, I would be able to say, like, undermine a local government using agorism.
So why do you call yourself an agorist then, if it's just sort of like a personal beneficial thing?
Because for me, and again, it's like looking at all of the different kind of like phylogeny of what people dissect anarchists into, right? Mm-hmm. I could just, I mean, most people, I just tell them I'm an anarchist, mm-hmm. right? The reason why I would say that I don't just say I'm an anarchist is because when I'm in circles with people that understand what anarchy is, mm-hmm. is that there's obviously different sects. And so to kind of narrow it down in terms of like, if you had asked me 12, 18 months ago, I would have told you that I was an ANCAP, right? Mm-hmm. But I think there's enough argument there too, where saying that you're an ANCAP also kind of opens the door for some level of like condoning of government involvement as the arbiter of, say, ownership of property.
What? I've never heard such a thing. What ANCAP would say that?
No, so they wouldn't say it, but ultimately that ends up being the manifestation. So, like, for instance, I mean, just look at what's happening down in Argentina, right? So Milei, I think, is a card-carrying ANCAP, right? Like, if you asked him what he was, he's an ANCAP, right? I mean, he cut his teeth as a Austrian economist, right? Like, that's what he is. So, but from that standpoint, you typically end up needing some kind of, I'll use quotes, like authority to validate ownership of property, right? And so when hard pressed, like the difference between, say, like a pure anarchy and anarcho capitalist society, right, is what anarcho capitalists would say is property rights, right? Because say you're a mutualist, or you're an anarcho socialist or communist, which a lot of people would say are complete contradictions to each other. Um, you would essentially say that your ability to, say, quote unquote, own property is dependent upon your ability to possess it, improve it, and defend it, right? And so, for instance, those types of anarchists are not in favor of me having a house that I live in and then also owning a house that I rent to someone else, because they would say I can't possibly own that house because I'm A, not living in it, I'm B, not there all the time to defend it, and if I'm not there, then I would essentially have to hire someone, right? And so, in the mind of a lot of anarchists, they've been critical of ANCAPs because they've said that ultimately it's not feasible to have like private property, protectors that are essentially going to say, oh, no, this is, Matt's piece of property that he owns and he rents to this couple, because then what would just stop the people from renting to be the people who are renting to be like, yeah, we're not paying you anymore, but we're still here and we have guns, so fuck off, right? Like, I mean, there's enough there where I'm like, all right, I kind of have to draw a line, right?
Well, I don't want to. I feel like I've taken over the interviewer role.
No, that's okay. I'm good with back and forth.
I would say, and I would defend, that anarcho-capitalism is the only anarchism. All others are either self-contradictory, communism, etc., or distinctions without a difference.
Okay.
And I don't say that to be edgy, but it's an edgy thing to say among anarchists because there's so many stupid adjective hyphenated anarchisms out there. There's like anarcho-veganism, anarcho-Christianism, Christian anarchists, which is just a whole other tier of contradictions. No rulers except for this one massive ruler. Yeah, okay. Yeah. But yeah, so all of the hyphen, it comes down to property and consent. That's sort of the foundation of all moral philosophy, as far as I can tell. Yep. And I wrote a manifesto for a moral philosophy I'm calling anti-subjectivism, that sort of establishes consent and property with as few arbitrary and subjective additions onto the laws of logic as possible. People can check that out at antisubjectivism.com/manifesto. A lot of the bifurcations and hyphenations of anarchism comes in when you start bolting on additional rules and restrictions to the property norms. If you look at sort of neo-Lockean property norms, you get a very short list of rules. 2 rules, really. Get there first, make first use of it, and then potentially, in certain circumstances, for clarity's sake, emborder it. So embordiment and first use. That's what I've been calling the neo-Lockean property norms. It's sort of like it's the Lockean property norms without the labor theory of value nonsense that he added in, having to mixture labor with it, which is all obviously nonsense.
Sure.
And we can get into that if you disagree. But so that's sort of the fundamental property norm. And what a lot of the hyphenations do is they bolt on additional rules. Your continued ownership is based on you never abandoning it, or going on vacation for too long, or renting it out to somebody else, or if it's an apple orchard and the apples are not growing because they're out of season for half the year, then the other half of the year somebody else can come in and do something else with the property. My point is they're adding additional rules onto the property norms.
Sure.
The purpose, the telos of property norms, is to reduce conflict over scarce and rivalrous resources. Mm-hmm. If you are adding additional restrictions, you are necessarily, by definition, adding additional points of contention and rivalrousness into the property system, and in so doing, making it a less efficacious system at being a property norm system by doing so. And you're also adding all sorts of contradictions, which are, again, additional points of conflict and rivalrousness. And which are all fine as long as you have consent of the property owners involved, but you can't bolt on additional stuff without sort of permission.
Right.
Is what I'm trying to say. And what I just described is anarcho capitalism. Now, how the conflicts that still would exist in any property system are resolved in terms of determining who has the highest claim to some given territory or property or item, is something for the market to resolve. And as long as it fits within the strictures or the restrictions of non-aggression, then you're still anarcho-capitalist.
Yeah. Well, so one thing that I've brought to the attention of
the last thing I was going to say.
Go ahead. Sorry.
The last thing I was going to say is that, just to address your, like the renter example, these people have bolted on an additional restriction onto what they will acknowledge as property, and in so doing made their property system more rivalrous. Are those people going to exist? Absolutely, certainly. Commies have always existed, and will unfortunately probably always exist. But you treat these people like you treat anybody else that refuses to reciprocate property norms with you. You sometimes need to use force against them, and that's justified.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting enough, I've raised this point to Agorists and other, self-proclaimed, different sects of anarchist, that blockchain actually is a private market solution to that. True. Right.
Yep.
And so, other than deferring to, say, the middleman of the county clerk or whatever in order to determine title of property and ownership, et cetera, you actually have a custodianship that's encrypted and able to be tracked. Just in terms of transparency, so that people have a common record of what is owned by whom. Right.
Yeah. Tokenized real estate. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. In fact. One of the ones I just started looking at was Lofty, Lofty. One of these kind of like startup, ones. Again, centralized, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's destined for failure, or that it's not something that I get a boner over because it's not decentralized. But but from that standpoint, interestingly enough, you mentioned, and so to sum up that conversation, I would say I feel like I'm an agorist because I do believe that agorism undermines, to a certain extent, the power and authority, because it withholds some of those sucks of assets and money and resources.
Sorry to interrupt. This is another distinction that I think we missed, or maybe I missed.
Sure.
I don't see... so when I talk about my isms, like if I call myself, I am an anarcho-capitalist, I am an anarchist, I am a voluntarist, whatever, there's a whole list of labels.
Yeah.
I'm describing how I want the world to be.
Sure.
Agorism to me seems more like a methodology of acting to make the world into a way, and not the end goal. Do you see it that way?
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So why would you call yourself a method as opposed to an end goal?
Because just inherent within the nature of anarchy, or just inherent in the nature of people in general, I don't want to make the world into anything. Right? So I don't want to make that determination for others. I would rather... So, like, for instance, as an agorist, I would have no problem being in a community of anarcho-capitalists. Right? I would voluntarily... As long as their idea of what constitutes property and ownership rights I'm good with, I would have no problem voluntarily being within that group. That being said, I don't want to make everyone else an agorist. I don't want to make everyone else an anarcho-capitalist, right? Or any kind of anarchist. I want them to be able to choose their own way, right? But I also believe in natural law to the standpoint of, if my philosophy conflicts with yours, a lot of the times our interactions eventually will, I mean, wouldn't use the word devolve, but they will default to natural law, right? So, like, for instance, just self-preservation, right? And defense of yourself, right? That's a natural law. Like, it doesn't require the Constitution. It doesn't require paperwork or anything like that. It's a natural endpoint. When someone feels attacked, they will defend themselves, right? So from that standpoint, if your position interferes with mine, or not interferes, if it aggresses upon mine, right? Like, if I want to live my life as an agorist or just a general anarchist, and your interpretation is that you should be able to aggress upon me in some way, shape, or form within my life, I'm going to non-violently at first, unless it warrants it, try to repel you. And then if that doesn't work, at the end, it's, guns at high noon, right? And so from that standpoint, I don't necessarily want the world to look a certain way, right? Like, I don't want to I live in New Jersey. This is one of the most socialist states in the entire country.
Why?
Right? Yeah, right.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It is one of the most socialist states in the entire country. I don't want New Jersey to look a certain way, right? But part of this might also be a differentiation as to why, this is a good question. Does it make sense to be an anarcho-capitalist in New Jersey? And to my extent, I don't think it is, because there's literally almost no one else here who I could be like, hey, let's agree on property rights with each other. There's just no one in my neighborhood, no one in my county, right? Like, so from my standpoint, agorism suits me more here, because I've tried to, like, find people to, like, commune with and things like that, and there's no point at which we would ever be able to come to some kind of understanding that, whatever constitutes property.
I think it just might come down to, I think we have different ideas about the labels we use. Like, if I say I want the world, I find
that's the case often with most people.
In all philosophy, it's all definitions. I want the world to contain zero coercion. I want consent to be respected everywhere, all the time.
Yeah.
I want property to be respected maximally, perfectly, if possible, although I'm not sure it's possible. Would you not agree with those statements about, wanting the world to contain zero coercion?
It would be nice if it was that way, but I don't think that that's realistic.
Oh, I'm not talking about, like, the praxis. I'm saying, like, the end goal. That's why, to me, these labels that we use for ourselves just describe how we would prefer the world to be, not necessarily the practicality of it, right?
I mean, it would be wonderful if that was the case, but it also depends on what you define as your world, right? Obviously,
all of reality.
I mean, for me, what do I have dominion over, right? I have dominion over myself. I have dominion over what I have immediately, possession of. I have somewhat dominion over my family, though I don't wield it, like we were talking before. Like, I completely agree with you. I unschool my children because I don't want them to defer to authority, right? Quite often they'll be like,
"Who do that in New Jersey?"
Actually, interesting enough, this is why I live in New Jersey. So in New Jersey, it is as far as I understand, the only state where you don't have to report your kids anywhere if they are homeschooled. And at a certain point in time, there was a governor that signed a bill that said if your kids are homeschooled, to get, like, a high school proficiency or diploma, all they have to do is take a couple of courses at a community college and pass those courses.
The entire state of Texas is like that. So you don't have to tell anyone or ask permission. And as far as I knew, Texas was the only state that was like that. So New Hampshire is not even like that.
It might be that most people ignore it. I've looked at most of the legislation. So, like, for instance, New Hampshire.
Well, cool. That's awesome. Then
New Hampshire requires you to report your children to a principal of a school. It doesn't say which one or anything like that. But again, the idealist within me is like, yeah, I'm not reporting shit. Right? Yeah. Like you shouldn't even know that my kids exist, right? Like that's the way that I feel the way
in
the
New
universe
York
should be, right?
In New York, you have to like submit them to be reviewed or tested by a certified teacher or something.
Yeah, there's all kinds of machinations where it's like some places you have to keep a portfolio of work. Yeah. Some places you have to follow an actual curriculum and they have to test and take like, the stupid standardized shit.
Well, I'm glad that your kids are safe there then.
Yeah, it's one of the selling points. And so within that, I feel like my dominion, right, is that's my world, right? The world that exists outside of that, the way I impact it is by living my life within my world. And then when I interact with that outside world, I mean, I share my philosophy, I show people how I live, that kind of thing, right? Like, I don't want to necessarily have those people be a certain way. I would prefer if they would choose a certain way of life, right? But like I said, at the end of the day, natural law takes over, right? So there's a point in time at which, we could play politics if we want, or we could try and undermine the state and be in black and gray markets and all this other stuff. But eventually natural law wins out, right? And so what does that look like?
What do you mean by natural law?
Well,
because a lot of people mean a lot of different things with those two words.
We might have to play the music. For me, natural law means that the outcome is self-evident. You get what you get because that's just the way it happens, right? And so, for instance, I know for a fact you're not like a big religious person, right? I came out of the Baptist church, fire and brimstone, right? Saved, baptized, that kind of thing.
I was raised Pentecostal Christian. I'm familiar.
Okay. So I went through a phase during my life where I was an adamant atheist. Okay. I was anti-everything, anti-religion, anti-spirituality, whatever, just science. That's it, right? Like whatever can be proven. I've since kind of gravitated back and been a little bit more, spiritual, whatever. We could talk about that or something later. But from that standpoint, I've been approached by people who are religious, and they ask, like, maybe it's time to come back to the church, or like, don't you want to live your life this way and that kind of thing. And I always tell them, like, I get to the same place you guys get to. I just get there from a little bit of a different path. I was like, you don't like having, you think it's sinful for someone to have lots of sexual partners and be philandering and all this other stuff, right? I agree as well, but not because I think God told me that that's bad. It's because on average, people that have that lifestyle suffer more negative natural consequences, right? And so natural law means that there are natural consequences for actions, okay? Another natural consequence is if you threaten me or my family, I'm going to respond with like kind and force, right? And so from that standpoint, I don't necessarily want the rest of the world to look like what my world looks like. If it does, great. That's fantastic, right? But at the end of the day, I can't force anyone to be anything. And so shit's just going to play out the way it plays out, right? It's part of the reason why I'm not really overly politically active anymore and why I became an anarchist in the first place, is because I see lots of people in the political sector like try and form the world into what they want it to be. And that's just not me, right? That's another reason why I would consider myself more so an agorist, because right now it seems like there's this groundswell of anarcho capitalists who, want to vote and they want to raise funds for a presidential candidate and they want to, pass bills and all this other stuff. And I'm like, y'all, if you really wanted an anarchist world, just take the case of Roger, or take the case of Julian Assange, or Snowden, or Ross Ulbricht, right? We'd be out in front of the prison with ARs, right? Like that's just the nature of it, right? But they choose, I say they, but people that are using the name anarcho-capitalist are choosing to use the force of government because they think they can wield it, right? And again, that might just be a differentiation in their definition or understanding of what it is to be an ANCAP.
I think you would benefit from zooming out your scope, because this is what happens when any label gains notoriety or starts getting filled with more human people. So like the Libertarian Party started out relatively very principled and on point because it had a very small number of people.
Yeah.
Now that it has, upward, coming up on, let's say, 1 million people, whatever, it becomes filled with a bell curve of beliefs. And on one side, you still have a lot of really principled anarchists. And on the other side, you have a bunch of people that actually want to get elected and wield government power, which is obviously absurd and self-contradictory with the party's own positions. But by nature of it becoming popular and a bunch of people joining that label, you necessarily get a dilution of its ideas. Same thing for Anarcho Capitalists. Like 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't have been having this particular criticism of Anarcho Capitalism because it was a tiny number of people. And now it's actually having its little moment in the spotlight. And it's the number of people that are calling themselves that, principled or otherwise, is growing. And so, boom, we're growing a bell curve. And on one side, we have people attempting to actually hold office and wield power, which is contradictory to anarcho-capitalists' ideas. Right. Even when I was running for not governor of Texas, I was running to literally, and I said this loudly and proudly, I'm running to dissolve the state government.
Yeah.
I'm not running to hold office and wield power. I'm running to end it. And my campaign was a referendum on ending the government, effectively.
I'm on record saying that the next presidential election I ever vote in will be one where the president promises to sell off the White House and turn the lights off and lock the door on the way out.
Right? Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I guess my whole point is you can't hold the less consistent like, dude, if agorism had its moment in the sun and started blowing up and 1 million people became agorists, guarantee you some of those agorists would be running for office and you would be embarrassed, just like I'm embarrassed to call myself a libertarian sometimes and an anarcho-capitalist sometimes. Like, humans are dumb and that's just how it works. So that was my only comments on that. I think, I'm glad we spent an extra hour here because we did nothing but open additional cans of worms to talk about. It was fun. It was good though.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And we're going to have to talk more because obviously there's so much more to dig into. I mean, we didn't even really touch on CBDCs or kind of how we can fight back against that kind of stuff. But I also think you dug into that with Aaron a little bit too. So
I don't know that there is a way to fight back. That's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that might be one of those things where it's just the writing's on the wall and the momentum is headed so fast in that direction that I don't know if you necessarily stop that train, right? Now, that being said, like, is there potential for being able to create some parallel economy, which, by the way, is more, I mean, it's not more, it's a shared agorist and ANCAP idea, right? Like creating parallel economies. Can you create one? Sure. But could it ever grow as quickly, right, as they can grow the adoption or force the adoption of CBDCs? Probably not, right? Nor do I think most normies would want to. Like, I was just thinking after I watched that interview where you were talking with Aaron, I was like, what could I do, right? Like, how could I fight back, right? Like, if I did want to try to influence the world outside of my immediate sphere, right?
You should start a podcast.
Well, I mean, it's the easiest. That's the point of least resistance, right? At least now it is when you have like Odyssey and some of the other platforms. But I was thinking, like, let's just make a farmer's market where we accept nothing but like Monero, Pirate Chain and gold and silver, right? And then my next thought was, okay, the first, FDA agent who knocks on the door and is like, hey, are you guys selling raw milk in there? Right? Like, how do we respond? And then my mind immediately goes to, all right, well, the moment that happens, now you need armed guards because that's the only way you protect them. Right. And unfortunately, that typically ends very violently. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So the way I see it is the society is a freight train, to use
Yeah.
your analogy. There's a lot of momentum of the mass moving in high velocity in the direction towards tyranny, and we're headed down. And we're still in a lot better position than people like to talk about and feel like we are. Like,
Yeah.
this goes to what was the White Pill book Michael Malice put out?
I believe it was The White Pill.
Yeah, he makes a very important point for us to realize, us doomer inclined people like myself, that things are still a lot better than we think they are, and they can get a whole lot worse. I do see the freight train, headed down quickly with a lot of momentum. And I also know that you don't change people that are comfortable, unfortunately. And what does that mean? It means things are going to have to get a lot worse before people demand change.
Yeah.
And so I think the strategy is to do the best you can to keep yourself safe and fed, and your family safe and fed, and your community of good people safe and fed. And I'm probably sounding like an agorist now because I agree with all this stuff. I started one of the world's largest voluntarist meetup groups in Dallas-Fort Worth area. We have hundreds of people that, work together and talk constantly. And, if we need anything, we help each other. And that's the stuff that we need to do to get ready for the hard times that are coming, because I don't think there's anything that we can do we don't have enough pull to modify the momentum of this freight train.
Yeah.
And so it's going to go where it's going to go, and we're going to see tyranny, and we're going to see hard times. And I think our best strategy is to keep ourselves safe, as successful and fed and healthy as we can, and our friends safe, successful, healthy and fed, and be there when the bottom comes and people start demanding change. And hopefully we can direct that change away from statism instead of begging for more tyranny, because what happens next is democracy fails and people demand a dictator. That's just the human species. That's what we do as a species, is, we demand change and we want somebody to come fix it. And democracy failed. I'm predicting the future. Look, democracy didn't work. So now we just need somebody to come in, an authoritarian, to take charge and right this ship and take ownership of it. The monarchists will return. That's my prediction. And so,
someone made a really fantastic point. They drew a parallel with 1929, and they said, you saw the same rise in the calls for socialism and Marxism leading into 1929. And it was because the economy began to fail ever before the Great Depression. And a lot of people got left behind. And so a lot of people forget, like, the Roaring '20s was great if you had a job. If you didn't have a job, you were fucking destitute, right? Like you had a shitty life. And so there was actually a lot of calls for socialism and Marxism headed into the Great Depression. And we got socialism as Marxism, right? We got Social Security. We got the beginnings of, Medicaid and Medicare and that kind of thing. And so from that standpoint, the same will happen. The question is whether or not there's enough loud, rational voices that are trying to dissuade people from going in that direction. And maybe, who knows, a farmer's market where you can get raw milk and eggs and keep your family alive while everyone is dying in bread lines and trying to pay with their CBDC. I don't know. But from that standpoint, I think we have a lot more to talk about. Actually, I would love to talk to you more offline about whatever initiatives, endeavors, how I can help. So whether it be up there or down there or up here, because God knows people in New Jersey are going to need it. Because
you're in New Jersey, man. You need our help, not we're good in Texas.
either way, but yeah. So from that standpoint, I think we have a lot more to talk about in the future. So,
sure, man.
All right, 2 hours. This was good. It like flew by too. When I tried to say goodbye at the end of the first hour, because I thought I was like being considerate and like assuming that you didn't have enough time.
I appreciate it.
I was like, shit, it's been like 15 minutes.
Goes by quick, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah. So with that, we'll be in touch, and hopefully I can have you on again, or maybe I can make a stopover on Anarchist.
Sounds good.
All right, thanks, Patrick.
All right, have a good one.